Hey folks, happy Independence Day weekend, 4th of July weekend. I am out at our hunting lease. This is an area where I'm at right now. I brought the tractor here, had a lot of work to do, and this particular spot I cleared an area into the trees to put up a trap, a pig trap. I'm going to put a clip. I'm going to show you a clip right quick. I'll just put it off to the side where you can see it. And that is a group of pigs that came out on this road that I'm on. Let me turn the camera. It's going to be a little loud. I'm sorry about that. It was right about here where my finger's pointing, right there. That's where them pigs came out. They tore the road up. What I did, I came up, I mowed all the roads, which is part of my job here. That's how I got in on this lease. I don't pay for a section like everyone else has to pay their way. I have a job here, which is to maintain the roads, the gates, whatever work needs to be done and has to be done, which is part of our contract under the maintenance section, then that is my job. And anyhow, I came here, and right here, all of it was like this. I cut me a swath through it. I'm going to show you what I got. And this is where the trap's going. I cut it back. The pigs, they'll come at night out on the road, but they're leery. But they've got trails going, through this edge, all through here. They got big trails beat down where they're traveling the edge of the road. And that'll be your mature pigs. I don't know how well you guys are going to be able to see it, but right back in there, like 10 feet, you can see where the trail comes from over here, and it curves and it goes that direction. And it crossed this section right here, somewhere right here. Right here is where they go in. I don't know, can you make that out? But that's where the pigs are going in, right there. And they were coming from right over here. All right, this, putting the debris in their path, when they come in, they will investigate to find out why their trail's blocked. Pigs are exceptionally smart. They smell the earth, where the earth is turned up, and that's going to pull them in to see what's going on in here. And we're going to put the trap in here. It's going to be set right here in this little pocket to where they have some shade. And then we'll put a feeder up. We'll have a feeder inside the trap right here. And then I'll put a piece of plastic. All it is the 2.5 gallon cooking oil jug, the plastic jug. I'll cut it, and then I screw it to the motor on the feeder where it slings the feed out. I'll screw it around the outside edge, and what'll happen when the feeder starts spinning, instead of the corn getting slung way out in the bushes, way out over there, it hits that deflector and it'll throw it straight down. And so it'll keep all the feed here in about a 10-foot circle. The trap is roughly 18 feet across. It's a round trap, and so the feed will only be inside the trap. And I've got a barrel, 50-gallon drum that's cut in half long ways. We'll put that in the ground. We'll run a couple of posts in the ground deep, and we'll screw that barrel to the post so the pigs can't flip it over. And then we come in here with buckets and we fill it up with water so that they have water, because they'll get inside of it also and nasty it up, but they have to have water. And then that'll give you a 3-day window where you don't have to check the trap every day of the week. In this heat, one day they're done. They'll die if they don't have water and a way to get out of the sun. That's why we're going to set the trap over here. That way it's going to come through right here. It's going to they'll have a little bit of this stuff here to get up under, to get out of the sun. And then of course they'll have the cool damp earth over there they can root up. We're not that high above the water table right here. If you dig down about 2.5 feet, you're in water. It is so hot out here. I'm trying not to move around much, get my blood pressure pumped up. It's 102 degrees heat index. I think it was 114. Have to check again, but it's pretty high. It's really hot. There's hardly any breeze at all. I mean, there's a very gentle little push you'll feel like just right then, and it's not even a mile an hour. It's just a little low, just a little bit of air movement. And I did not spray down, so I'm probably gonna get ticks on me. But anyway, we're gonna go with this. All right, this first article is titled "Stomping and Screaming Goatman Once in Our Cabin." The year is not exactly known, but it is within recent years. The location is North Dakota. The information source for this article is multiple eyewitnesses and hundreds of tracks found. Cabins can be so creepy, or at least it's my fault for letting myself get creeped out by something that's supposed to be a vacation getaway. I always read dozens of creepy stories on the internet of strange happenings at cabins, but I never thought that I would experience anything creepy for myself. My friend and I decided to go up to my grandma's cabin one winter. The cabin was deep in the woods of North Dakota, and it was a beautiful place. It's where I had stayed with my grandparents growing up, but now I was in college and I wanted to relax after some hard semester finals. The night was exactly what I thought it would be. Playing video games, talking, and laughing. In the morning, I drank coffee and I read a book on the couch, and I wished I could have spent every day like that. It wasn't until the second night that things started to get weird. My friend called me as she came back inside the cabin from going to the gas station. Sorry, y'all. Something just hit the limb that camera, the little tree the camera's on. I don't see nothing up there, but that's twice that's happened. Okay, I'm sorry. My friend called to me as she came back inside the cabin from going to the gas station to get cigarettes. I asked her what was up, and I saw her enter the front door backwards while keeping her eye on something just beyond the glass of the front door. "Do you see it?" she murmured very quietly. I looked out through the front glass window and saw only the snow-covered road that emerged from the woods and led up to our driveway. Before I could even answer her, I saw a dark figure step out of the tree line and onto the snow-covered road. It had a long stride, and in just a few steps it had crossed the road to the other side. It just stopped there and turned in all directions. My friend asked, "Who the heck is that, or what is it?" "I have no idea," I said. "There are no cabins close to here, and the gas station you went to is the closest thing to us, and that's 20 minutes away at that." My mind was reeling. Who was the guy just standing out in the driveway? The dark figure then turned around and retraced his footsteps, and in just a few strides it crossed back over the road and disappeared in the woods. We both put on our jackets and boots, as we were both curious first and scared second. We stepped out on our driveway and headed to the road that led into the woods. The snow was at least 8 inches deep. As soon as we got to the spot where the dark figure stood, we saw the tracks in the snow. Hoof tracks, like a goat or sheep had been walking around. We saw nothing else around, and the dark figure was nowhere to be seen, just the tracks. There was no other animals out there unless some man had been walking with his goat, which is not what we both saw. We both looked at each other, and we went back inside the cabin and warmed ourselves by the fireplace. The TV was on, and we felt a little weird, but I was able to eventually fall asleep rather easily. Loud stomping or clomping woke me back up. Thud, thud, thud. Where was it coming from? I didn't know, but it was loud enough to wake me from my sleep. Peeking out from my bedroom windows, I saw nothing out there. It had snowed lightly in the past few hours. It must have been my friend stomping down the hallway to get a drink of water, I thought. She had never been very light-footed anyway. Thud, thud, thud. Now I knew the sound was not coming from inside the house. Now, fully awake, I got my blanket and headed to the living room. It must have been a full moon because the windows shone with quite a bit of moonlight, enough to make out details at the wood line. My friend was already there hiding behind the recliner looking out the window, and before I could ask her what she had seen, a tall silhouette appeared behind the curtains of the window. Thud, thud, thud. Someone or something was now on our porch. It walked back and forth from the front door to the window, over and over again. It looked like it was trying to peek through any gap in the curtains. Instinctively, I ran over to be with my friend behind the recliner. She said it had been there for the last hour on the front porch, and she doubted it could hear us inside. This pacing back and forth while stomping on the snow on the front porch went on for a while, and then it started pounding on the front door with its fists, trying to break down the front door. I couldn't keep myself from trembling, and not from the cold. Suddenly the pounding stopped, and that's when we heard the loudest, weirdest scream, which in no way was human. It lasted for a whole minute, an otherworldly screeching, and then it stopped. There was silence, no stomping, screeching, or pounding on the door. We did not go back to our rooms, and we did not go to sleep. We sat there together, hunched down all night. As soon as daylight shone through the thick curtains, we packed up and left. I have no idea what this thing was, but we found hundreds of hoof prints on our porch, and there was not a single human footprint or boot print. Whether this thing was human or monster, I still want to know one thing. Where did all those hoof prints come from? And that's the end of that Goatman article. Yeah, that would be a bad situation to be in. I don't know how I would handle the dealing with something like that. I don't know if I could. You know, as all of you guys know that have been here with us, you know, for a long time, guys, I'm always armed. The only time I don't have a physical firearm on me is when I'm laying in bed, but I've got 3 that I can touch without ever leaving the bed. From lying position, I've got 3 on my side of the bed. Kim has 2 on her side. We are a family that does believe in protecting ourselves and those who are with us, those that are around us, whether we know them or not. If a situation arises in which there has to be a gun drawn, we are on the ready. Something like that were to try to break in and stomp in, and you know, I don't know that I would pull the trigger. I can't say that I would. I really don't know. But fear, you know, there's been a lot of people through history that have been shot, that have had worse things happen to them because of trying to scare their friends, or, you know, something happened and the friend's reaction is to pull a firearm and start squeezing the trigger. That has happened a lot. And not so much in the, you know, in the recent 20 years, I guess, but you know, at one time it was very prevalent for people to try to pulling pranks on their friends, and it ended up fatal. So I don't know what I would do. If I recognized it as being not human and trying to get in, yes, I would fill the door with holes, without a doubt. I'll do whatever's necessary to prevent it from coming in. Shooting holes through the door with a handgun, it leaves little round holes in the door. It's not going to disable the door. With a shotgun, you could possibly destroy the hinges, you could destroy the jamb, and if it doesn't phase whatever's trying to get in, now you've basically unlocked the door for them. So yeah, I would not be firing a shotgun. But anyhow, I'll carry on. I don't know that I would fire it. You know, when I had my encounter in Mariana with that thing, he was 2 feet from me, I guess. I mean, he was right on top of me. I could have reached out and touched him very easily without extending my arm all the way. And I had a loaded 7mm short mag in my hands, finger on the trigger. Safety was off, and the barrel, the way I was holding it, the muzzle was pointed toward his right shoulder. If I would have squeezed the trigger, I would have hit him somewhere in the upper chest of his right side, and I was too afraid to pull the trigger. It was just a lot of mass right there, and I didn't think it'd do nothing but make him mad at me. But anyway, I'm sorry for babbling. I don't know what that was. I've got guys, I'm sorry, I have to keep checking my phone. I've got a savings account I started with Credit Karma a couple of years ago, and I didn't have much in it, $40, I think, $50. But I went to check it this morning out of curiosity, and somebody withdrew it. The account's closed, and it was gaining really high interest, and it was closed down. Somebody withdrew the money in May, and so I reached out to them this morning, and I'm expecting a reply back. I did speak to someone, but due to it possibly being fraudulent activities, they had to move it to a different department, and they sent me a confirmation email that they have the documents. They're going over it now, so I'm just waiting a response. So I apologize if you see me checking my phone. Just if they do call, I don't want to miss it, because somebody is, if they've got into that account, then obviously they've got my personal information and they could hack into my other accounts, and that's what I'm trying to avoid. All right, moving forward. Sorry about all the babbling. All right, this one's titled Goatman in My Truck Bed. In the year is the mid-1990s. The location is in Kentucky, and the information source for this article is eyewitness testimony. Back in the mid-1990s, I would run tree limbs along a long, winding road in the backwoods of Kentucky in my old Ford pickup truck. Growing up in Kentucky, I heard countless stories of strange things. They were usually strange creatures in the woods sightings, but after living there for 30 years, I had never seen anything strange. I worked and drove through the woods on a daily basis, and I was sure that if I was going to see something weird, I would have already seen it. I was dead wrong. We were finishing loading up some dead tree limbs in my pickup. The last part of my day was picking up and packing the wood and then driving it across the county. The scenery was beautiful and I loved it. I listened to my favorite music, and being alone with my thoughts was nice. One evening when the sun was setting above the tree line, I was passing an old pasture, and on the side of the road ahead of me I could see a large dark mound just next to the barbed wire fence that separated the road from the pasture. I slowed down as I got closer, and curiosity got the better of me. As I got closer, the sight of the thing made me a bit nervous, because driving up on the body of any dead animal would make anyone nervous. On the roadside lay a dead cow with its eyes bulging from its sockets, with flies continuously in its eyes. Driving closer, I wanted to know what might have killed this cow. There were tufts of fur hanging on the barbed wire fence beside the cow, as if it had tried to run through or jump over the fence. There were no marks on the body. Maybe it died of a heart attack out of fear of being chased by wild dogs or coyotes, which were rampant in these parts of Kentucky. Before I could put my truck back in drive, I felt the thud. Something had fell into the bed of my pickup truck. Immediately, I turned to look out of my back window with the sun almost completely set by now. I scanned the bed full of tree branches and I saw nothing, but then a patch of grass or fur caught my attention in the taillight. It was laying in the branches and then stood up on two legs. I could only watch in horror and disbelief as this thing leaned forward and could partially be seen in the brake light, which I had my foot on the whole time. In a few seconds, this thing leaned forward and I could make out what I was looking at, and it was no man. It was covered in dirty, matted fur from head to toe. Its two legs didn't bend like a human's does, but twisted backwards at the knees. Its upper body had little fur, and I could see skin underneath. Its face was inhuman, yet human and beast at the same time. Reacting out of fear, I stepped on the gas and I took off quickly, and the beast jumped out of the bed and landed in the middle of the road unscathed. Its silhouette just stood there in the dark, growing fainter as I accelerated away. It was at least 6 feet tall, and it towered over the lower barbed wire fence on the side of the road. I have no idea what happened that night, but I can tell you my drives now through that area are no longer fun or enjoyable. As I drive past that pasture, I still feel like I'm being watched, and I can't help but driving a little faster through that area. Did the dead cow have any connection to my encounter? I feel now like this creature had set a trap for me, or maybe I'm overthinking it. I wish I would not have stopped to examine that dead cow. Never have I been so afraid in a place that has been my home all my life. I hope to God I never break down on that road. The conclusion reads, it has been widely documented on many encounters involving cryptids that laid traps for people driving vehicles in order to get them to stop and possibly exit the safety of their vehicle to examine something strange, and then the attack happens. For instance, cunning dogman creatures are claimed to run in front of moving vehicles or play injured on the side of the road, or kill or injure a pet and place it on the side of a dark road only to have the driver stop and exit the safety of their vehicle. The strange sight, and they themselves become a victim of the awaiting cryptid. More than likely, this Goatman did set a trap for this guy using a dead cow that it had killed. Although he slowed down, staying in his truck and not exiting, and quickly taking off when he realized this creature had fell in his truck bed, is what saved his life. Yeah, that would be a horrifying encounter. But anyhow, here we go. All right, this is titled, A Pack of Wolf-Headed Men Destroy a Family Ranch in Taylor, Mississippi. Warning, some parts of this are graphic. This is the article. If you're weak in the stomach or you have young children, either have someone listen to this first before you do, so they can give you a heads up if it's going to bother you or not, or if you have young children, please listen to it before you allow them to listen to it. All right, the year is 1948 and the location is Taylor, Mississippi, which is Lafayette County, on formal tribal lands of the Chickasaw Indian Nation. The information source is many eyewitnesses' testimonies, that including the Lockett family, a logging foreman, loggers, the sheriff and sheriff's deputies, family friends, wildlife and game officials, and local hunters. Also, track evidence found structural destruction of the ranch house and wanton slaughter of dogs, farm animals, and local deer. The preface states, the following is an interesting, long, and very detailed, yet harrowing account of one Mississippi family's ranch and their struggle to survive a siege of a pack of 20 wolf-headed men led by a very large, powerful gray wolf man that stood 10 feet tall. These creatures even tried to destroy the ranch house by climbing on the roof and digging a hole to burrow underneath the floorboards to compromise the structural integrity of the foundations. Sorry guys, sweat just poured in my glasses and now I can't see. I got a bad blurry spot. Sorry. It's only 102, so I don't know why I'm sweating. And I'm losing articles. Jeez. I apologize. There has been a hot debate on the validity of this story, with skeptics saying this is nothing more than a good fabricated campfire story. The listener will have to decide on that issue, but some things mentioned in the story are factual, such as census records of 1940 and 1950 do show a family with the last name of Lockett. The Lockett family ranch is said to be in Taylor, Mississippi, which is in Lafayette County. Lafayette County is in the area of the former tribal lands of the Chickasaw Indian Nation, which plays into the events of the story, and it is mentioned. Number 3, Sardis Lake is mentioned, and it does exist just north of Taylor. Number 4, the behavior and physical descriptions of these wolf-headed men in this story do match what people describe they encounter even today. Number 5, the town of Taylor and its outlying areas are a hotbed of dogman sightings and encounters, which include a separate family farm and its dealings with a pack of wolf-headed creatures and a Bigfoot, or as the Chickasaw Indians called them, Lofa. And number 6, it is a fact that dogman creatures haunt and roam cemeteries and Indian tribal lands, past and present, which include burial areas and mounds. 2 encounters come to mind of such activity, one being the defunct Coletta Covent Hospital in Wisconsin, where a dogman was seen twice standing on a nearby Indian mound, and another case where hikers had 2 dogmen run past them only to run ahead to an Indian mound, and from the top raise their heads and howl. Whether these facts will convince a person that the story is true will be left up to the listener. Warning, some parts of this are graphic. Some parts of this story may be too much for some or too overwhelming according to what you can tolerate or what you have encountered yourself. The story includes the slaughter of farm animals, bloody remains, shots from guns fired at attacking cryptids, and very intense situations during survival against attack, so be warned. Purchasing the land. I will not mention the location of my family's property, and in exchange I will do my best to explain to you about these creatures you call dogmen. My first encounter with these creatures was when I was 12 years old. My family's lineage goes back to 1832 when Taylor, Mississippi was founded. My family was one of the first ones to move into this area to work the mills owned by John Taylor, who the town is named after. Eventually my ancestors, the Lockett family, were able to acquire a sizable piece of land. My grandfather, Edward Lockett Sr., and my grandmother, Virginia Lockett, built a farm. My mother, Elizabeth Lockett, died at childbirth, and I was raised... That messed me up. I think this may be worded wrong. My mother, Elizabeth Lockett, died at childbirth. Maybe she died giving birth. And I was raised by my father, Edward Lockett Jr., and my grandparents. As a boy, I was responsible for a number of chores around the property, ranging from feeding the hogs and chickens to gathering corn from the fields. Simple tasks that most children today never do. The property my family owned was very large, with areas that had never been explored. For example, if you can imagine a 5-acre rectangle clearing in the woods with the property oriented north to south, with our home at the southeast corner of the clearing. Behind our home was a cornfield that extended the entire depth of the clearing south to north and stopped 75 feet from the wood line. To the west of the cornfield was our barn, hog pens, chicken coop, and storage shed. Further west was a ridge line that ran the length of the clearing south to north. At the base of the ridge was a drainage ditch, and back towards the house was a dirt road. I was told that the property was purchased from the Chickasaw Indians, who were a proud and civilized people with their own laws like a religion. But above all things, they were warriors, and they developed a fierce fighting force. My father said deep within the boundaries of our property lay the heart of the Chickasaw Nation, a place where they buried their dead and praised their gods. 1948. Local sawmill begins logging and everything changes. Life was very quiet on our farm until 1948. That's when my grandfather signed a deal to provide oak and hickory wood to a local sawmill. From that day on, the property was teeming with life. Logging trucks going back and forth constantly and people on the land. The dirt road was widened and trees were cleared deep into the woods, creating a roadway that led to the backside of our property. After 2 weeks of work, my father and I drove 7 miles of road cleared in our woods. There were huge oak trees and limbs that grew in all directions, twisting and turning and covered with moss. You could tell this area of old growth had not been disturbed by humans in a very long time. It had a feel to it like there was something just waiting beneath the surface or lurking. My father was not very comfortable in this area at all. As I climbed the limbs, he urged me to return to the truck, and I'll never forget the look of fear on his face, fear of the unknown. He knew something was not right. The following week, full-scale logging began on the property. A crew of 30 men with a foreman named Mr. David were present on the property daily. My grandfather and his friend Barnabas spent hours deep in the woods hunting and trapping. I was on one of their hunting trips that my grandfather was alerted that I'm sorry guys, it's just punctuation error. I was on one of their hunting trips when my grandfather was alerted that something was wrong on the property. While hunting beyond where the logging was taking place, they came across several severed deer heads. One of the heads had been stuck on a stick that was stuck in the ground. It seemed like a marker of some sort. During dinner that night, his friend Barnabas described the feeling of being watched from all angles when they had found the deer heads earlier that day, like the forest was alive. A missing logger, a bloody shirt terrify the workers. Shortly after these stories started coming from the loggers of fast-moving figures that would follow them out of the woods, which made them start to leave the area long before sunset. The foreman, Mr. David, was not superstitious at all and insisted the men work every minute of daylight possible. I remember it was a Tuesday evening right before sunset when a group of loggers came barreling down the road in a pickup truck, driving like they were running for their lives. They were met at the front of the property by Mr. David, who stood there blocking the road. He was a tall man at 6 feet 9 inches and towered over most other men and had worked in the logging business since 19 years of age. Standing there in front of the approaching speeding truck, I knew he was fearless. The men came to a stop just before hitting him and all exited the truck with some looking back towards the woods and ridgeline. Others looked like they had seen a ghost. All at once they began to speak like a symphony of chaos and fear. The point being made that one of the men had disappeared and only found his torn shirt with blood on it, but nothing else. These men were tough loggers who had seen death many times in the form of gruesome accidents. But whatever this was, that scared them, that was not normal. One of the men said he was talking to the man and he was right behind me when I heard a grunt and I looked behind and he was gone. It was like he had vanished into thin air. There's something in these woods we do not need to be messing with, sir. Mr. David, my father and grandfather all went into the woods that night looking for the missing logger, and when they returned, they were speaking in hushed tones, which was very unusual in my house, for there were no secrets kept in the house. My grandfather believed there should be no secrets in a house. A boy should be raised to be a man, but that night something was being kept a secret, and I knew it. 4:30 a.m. The first smashing attack and canine prints. That secret came spilling out at 4:30 a.m. the next morning. The dogs we kept began barking like I have never heard before. We had 4 dogs of mixed breeds, German Shepherd and Collie. They were large and smart, but this barking was different than anything I had heard before. When I moved into the living room, everyone was already awake with guns in hand and ready. Confused, I asked my grandmother what was going on, and that's when she told me the truth. The men had shot a large animal in the woods earlier that night, and they believe others followed it back to the house. The dogs were quickly brought into the house, and me and my grandmother were rushed into the attic. Before we could hear the dogs running from room to room, barking and growling, below we could hear the dogs running room to room, barking and growling. Then above all the barking and talking came a growling sound that I swear shook the floorboards in the attic. My grandmother moved towards the attic window and looked out, but didn't describe what she saw to me. And she didn't need to, because the way she reacted, I knew it was some kind of monster. Then there was the sound of smashing against the side of the house over and over again, followed by gunfire for 1.5 hours. Shots rang out through the night as multiple growls shook the house, which silenced the dogs all at once. Then there was a howl in the distance, and all activity stopped. The next morning, my grandmother packed her things and went over 2 towns to stay with Mr. David's wife. She didn't say much as she left, but she touched my head. That day, there were more loggers on the property than I had ever seen, and they were not equipped with saws, but with guns and rifles. This is a graphic part, you guys. Giving you a heads up right now. This next paragraph. There was a large group of men gathered along the side of the house talking, and when I weaved my way through to see what they were talking about, it was a dead hog that had been smashed against the house, and only a blob of fat, bone, and blood remained. The blood splatter was on the side of the house, and the smell of blood and the flies made my stomach turn. There were very large canine prints everywhere around our house. The first investigation and the hunt. Guys, I'm sorry, I'm having to keep wiping sweat off. It's running down my glasses and I can't see. I have a sweat disorder and I sweat like ridiculously bad. I sweat when it's 30 degrees out, and I literally sweat like I ran a marathon. The first investigation and the hunt. That day we ventured deep into our property in search of these canine beasts. 34 men and a boy, me. The landscape varied from hills, ridges, and large moss-covered oak trees that barely let any sunlight in, and the wetlands with waist-deep water that was hard for my 12-year-old body to traverse through with my gun high above my head. Beyond the wetlands, we came across these giant structures or nests, like someone or something had burrowed its way into the ground. By noon, we were trekking our way out back to the trucks, and Mr. David and my father found what they believed to be a Chickasaw Indian burial mound. There were rocks that formed a rectangular shape inside a clearing, with a steep incline forming a mound by 2 trees. This discovery seemed to bother Mr. David, and he hurried us back to the truck. We arrived back at the house just before sundown, and a head count was done, and all 34 were present, including me. 10 men volunteered to stay in the barn that night as armed guards. Me, my father, grandfather, and Mr. David all stayed in the house. 2 dogs were left in the barn and the other 2 in the house. The second attack. The big gray one appears first, and Charlie is killed. That night, my father stepped onto the back porch for a smoke, and that was the first time I saw the dogman with my own eyes. I was opening the porch door to bring my father some matches when I saw a large figure standing among the rows of corn in the field. The corn was beginning to die and turn brown, and this large gray figure was lit up by the moonlight. Our dog Charlie raced past me through the open door, positioning himself between me and this gray figure, which had to be 10 feet tall. Initially, it was not looking my way, but the growling from our dog Charlie got its attention. As it turned to face Charlie, the moon gave its eyes an amber color, which allowed my mind to come to terms that this was some kind of monster. Then it stepped forward out into the open. I still remember what my dad said. Oh my goodness. And what I saw was a giant wolf head 4 times the size of our dog Charlie's head, and its snout was thick, wide, and long. It had a scar on its nostrils. Then there was this popping noise like the sound of a human joint cracking, but way louder, and this monster was down on all fours in a second. My father reacted, pulling me into the house while firing off a shot and closing the door. Charlie was left outside to fend for himself. There was barking and a loud yelp. Charlie cried out in pain, and then came the loud thud on top of the back door. This is another graphic section, you guys. I'm sorry. This next few minutes, there's going to be some graphic stuff in it. That night was horrific, with gunfire, loud screams, and the hogs and chickens panicking. There was a sound of something dragging its claws across the entire length of the house. I could hear them on the roof walking. They were looking in the windows and growling. My father's best friend, Barnabas, counted 12 different creatures that night. They were sure they were hitting these things with their bullets, but it didn't slow them down at all. That night was terrifying, and in the morning, the 10 men in the barn shared their descriptions of these beasts. Some were slender and lean with shorter snouts. They all would switch from 2 legs to all 4s very quickly. They found Charlie's dead body torn to pieces among the rows of dead corn. That day, no one showed up to log the property, and 5 of the 10 volunteers left the property and urged my family to leave as well. Barnabas was on the fence about staying. Mr. David was hell-bent on staying and finishing the job to get paid. The foreman, Mr. David, replaces the workers. Another graphic section. Mr. David went to the next county and hired 15 new workers who were told they had to spend the night in the barn to be ready to work at daylight. That crew of 15 men only lasted 24 hours. They all left in the middle of the night when a deer carcass was dropped in through the roof of the barn. The deer was still kicking and moving as it hit the barn ground, squirting blood from its neck where its head had been torn off. Jeez. 8 big game hunters enter the woods. Only 1 survives. This was the beginning of the end of my time staying at this farm, as my father was now very worried about me being on this property. Meanwhile, my grandfather had met a man who was part of a big game hunting club and was seeking his help. He tried to explain the nature of these animals they would be hunting, and the man was sure he could track and kill them. So the next day, 8 big game hunters went into the woods on the backside of the property with intentions of spending the night. At 5 a.m., only 1 man returned, frantically beating on the back door of the house. He was speaking gibberish and had lost his mind from whatever he had saw. That very day, I was taken to stay with my grandmother 50 miles away. 2 weeks later, first abandonment of a devastated ranch. 2 weeks later, there was nothing left of the farm. The chickens and hogs were all killed along with the dogs. The barn had been set on fire in order to escape the big gray one that stood 10 feet tall. That was the name given to the large gray wolf. That was the name given to the large gray wolf I had saw in the corn. It turned out to be the leader of the pack of 20 dogmen. My grandfather finally abandoned the property one evening before dusk, and while leaving, spotted the big gray one and 10 other dogmen on the ridge looking down at the house. He realized even daylight provided no security from these monsters. His intentions were to leave and regroup and return to claim our ancestral farm. 2 months later, the first risky return to the ranch. It had been 2 months since our family abandoned our ancestral property, so my father and grandfather said they were going back to retrieve some personal items, including the deed to the property. I was both excited and worried. So with me, my father, grandfather, and Barnabas, we all four drove the hour-long drive to the farm. The sight of the house brought back memories of the night I spent in the attic with my grandmother, and the creatures my dad and grandfather were now calling Wolfman. The sound of my dog Charlie being killed, the howling sound of them walking on the roof came flooding back to me like a faucet of memories. Barnabas opened the door to the truck and stepped out with his shotgun, and he told me to go to the roof, and if I saw anything, to fire one shot and don't shoot at it. My father backed the truck right up to the front porch, and I climbed back on the back of the truck and to the roof of the house, which I could see the entire property that fallen into such disarray. No more cut grass, instead weeds and vines growing up the side of the house. I felt a dark energy surrounding the property, and it felt gloomy. Staring at the shell of my house, these creatures had taken everything from my family. I was angry and not afraid. While my father and grandfather searched the house, I began to catch that scent of wet hair and urine from one of the creatures blowing in from the north side of the property. Over by the barn was one of them with its snout in the air sniffing. I was downwind, so it wasn't me he was smelling. This one was smaller than the others I had seen. It was standing on its hind legs looking around. It was jet black, and its fur stood out against the red paint of the barn. After a few seconds of standing there, it leaped 30 feet into the wood line. I wasn't sure it hadn't seen me, and I wanted to alert the other men of the dogman's presence. But instead of firing a shot, I jumped down into the bed of the truck and I entered the front door of the house. Why did I do that? Our beautiful home had been ransacked. Broken furniture with claw marks everywhere on the walls. The back door was completely broken in half. There I found my father sitting on a wooden stool among all the destruction, and he was in tears. I told him I had just saw one, and he quickly looked up, wiped his face, and said it's time to go. My grandfather emerged from his bedroom with a stack of papers and photos in his hand. Barnabas followed closely behind him with a shotgun. We quickly exited the house, got into the truck, and pulled away. And as we did, Barnabas pointed out that up on the ridgeline stood the big gray one. Its huge head and muscular body was unmistakable. That day is forever etched in my mind. The big gray one became more than just a monster. He became the nemesis of our family, an enemy that lurked in the shadows. That day, my grandfather decided he was going to kill the huge 10-foot tall gray one. 1 month later, selling part of the property and preparing for war. The next month, my grandfather sold 100 acres of the family property that was west of the house to a wealthy shipping company who wanted land with easy access to the river. He hired a blacksmith to make 2 different kinds of traps. One was similar to a bear trap, but 4 times bigger, with 12-inch spikes that curled inwards and shut. The second trap was smaller, but used the same 12-inch spikes. Grandfather and Barnabas hired another crew of hunters to guard the property while contractors worked to reinforce our home, adding a 6-inch thick tin roof, special-made 6-inch thick reinforced doors, and the fireplace was bricked shut. Grandfather had made our home into a fortress. The next 13 months was an all-out war to reclaim our property from these wolfmen. A Chickasaw Indian elder reveals historical truth of the land. Barnabas, my grandfather's best friend, was assigned to do research on these creatures, and he was able to contact a member of the Chickasaw Indian tribe who took him to the oldest living member of the Chickasaw Nation. What he learned was both shocking and frightening. Indeed, our property was in the heart of their Chickasaw Nation, and they knew very well about the wolfman our family had encountered. They called them this is going to be a hard one. Nas Hoba Iskoba Ha Tata Nakanen, meaning wolf-headed man. The wolfman had roamed the land for hundreds of years along with what they called Lofa, which today we call them Bigfoot. The Chickasaw and Choctaw tribes had come to respect and fear both of these creatures. The Wolfmen were fearless hunter-killers and lived on the deer of the land. He told Barnabas of a story of a hunting party of 10 men who ventured out to gather food. These men were expert hunters and trackers and were the first to come across these wolfmen. The hunters had tracked a large wounded buck into a certain area they had previously not ventured into. The land today is known as Lake Sardis, but back then there was no lake, just wetlands. They came to a forest and found the buck there torn to pieces with its head resting on a tree branch 15 feet in the air. Then, from the trees, the wolfmen attacked their party, slashing and biting, and only one man was able to escape. That night, the village children reported seeing large black wolves with red eyes that shined from the fires in the camp. The next day, both Chickasaw and Choctaw sat down and had a meeting. They decided to send out 2 groups of warriors to the area to kill the beasts, and what they encountered was a pack of 5 wolfmen, and they were forced to retreat. Confused and frightened, the Chickasaw and Choctaw chiefs decided to send out 2 of their most fearless warriors into the land of Lofa, or Bigfoot. Their job was to steal buried bones of the Lofa, the Bigfoot, and take them to the land of the Wolfman in hopes that the Lofa, the Bigfoot, would come to the land of the Wolfman to retrieve their bones. They traveled for 4 days northwest, and they finally reached their destination. The 2 warriors entered a clearing at sunset where they found large mounds surrounded by stones, and in the middle was a structure made of large tree branches. This is another graphic section right here. They were able to steal a skull of one of the Bigfoot, but on the way back, the 2 warriors were separated from each other. When the Chickasaw warrior found the Choctaw warrior, his body had been torn into pieces. His arms and legs had been ripped off and spread about. When the Chickasaw warrior reached his village with the Bigfoot skull, a group of warriors was assigned to take the skull to the land of the Wolfmen. After 3 attempts, they were successful. This started a war between the Lofa, the Bigfoot, and the Wolfmen, and it raged for years. The Chickasaw and Choctaw were successful in that they had found an adversary in the Bigfoot against the Wolfmen, but it eventually failed in that both tribes became hunted by both Bigfoot and Wolfmen. Leaving the area, food supply in shadows, the Chickasaw were forced to move further south out of the heart of the area to search for food. Barnabas learned that the very same land my family owned is the very same land the Chickasaw Indian tribe abandoned. The local sheriff comes calling, and foul play is suspected. This came as a shock to my grandfather, who never even knew these creatures existed. And on top of this, my grandfather would soon have other issues to deal with. Issues like explaining how 7 men had gone missing on his property. One evening, he was paid a visit by the sheriff, who insisted he explain what was going on. My grandfather explained that the men had been attacked by wild animals and had simply gone missing. That day, my grandfather was taken into custody by the sheriff. While in custody, the sheriff organized a search party to go in to find the 7 missing men. The sheriff believed our family was guilty of foul play. Initially, the search party was going out into the woods unarmed, but the foreman, Mr. David, who had connections, insisted the men bring dogs and guns for their search. The events of that day left no doubt that my family was innocent of any wrongdoing. The sheriff becomes a believer, and the search party goes all wrong. As the sheriff's search party was being organized, witnesses were being interviewed of the events of the past weeks. The 10 men who stayed in the barn that night as armed guards told their stories of the beasts that attacked the barn that night. My grandfather, father, and Mr. David all shared their experiences, which initially fell on deaf ears. However, in just 24 hours, my family's name would be cleared. The sheriff had finally organized the search party he wanted. 20 civilians, 10 sheriff's deputies, and 5 men from the wildlife and fisheries. And they were about to experience firsthand the terror of these creatures. Barnabas and Mr. David volunteered to join the group, even though they knew how risky it was to venture into this area. Guys, I gotta sit on this towel. I'm sorry. This bucket is hurting me. Find my spot. Okay. The search party left at daybreak, equipped with the torn shirt of the first missing logger and 7 dogs to track the scent. The men spread out, forming a line with each man 45 feet apart from each other in the woods. The first 7 miles of the journey they experienced nothing. However, when they reached the area of old-growth, moss-covered oak trees, the woods took on a more sinister feel. The scent dogs in the lead began to slow their pace and behave abnormally. Excuse me. One dog laid on the ground and refused to move at all. As they moved deeper into the woods, all the dogs began pulling to go the opposite direction, trying to leave the area. Barnabas remembered seeing dog figures moving quickly in front of them and behind them. The sheriff insisted the men press forward to continue the search. The terrain changed to muddy wetland, and then the men spotted their first set of fresh prints. Bipedal, canine-like tracks the size of a grapefruit. The prints went on for a few yards, then disappeared. Then all of a sudden, the dogs began to bark and look up into the trees and trying to pull away. 2 dogs broke their leash and ran in the other direction. There was rustling sounds in the trees above their heads, and they began to hear growling noises from all directions. Some of the men began to panic and broke the line, backing away to flee out of the area. Barnabas would later tell my father and I that the creatures moved with such ease that it was frightening. He spotted them darting from tree to tree, some on the ground with others in the air. At the same time, some were running the ridge line above to cut the men off. Shooting broke out in all directions, and one of the men from the wildlife and fisheries was shot in the arm. After a short burst of confusion, the sheriff's deputies were able to round all the men together and form a circle to get out of there. When they all arrived back at the farmhouse, the sheriff was at a loss for words, and when Barnabas asked the sheriff if he believed my grandfather now, he simply radioed the police station and had him released. Concerned, the sheriff offered to leave armed deputies at the house to assist and guard my family, but my grandfather declined this offer due to the fact that there was already enough dead people on my grandfather's conscience, and he did not want any more. Waiting for Wolfman retaliation and personal struggles. My grandfather, father, and Barnabas, along with Mr. David, hunkered down and waited for the creatures to retaliate. The sheriff's men had trespassed on the Wolfman's land, and they were sure to come back that night. Meanwhile, me and my grandmother began dealing with our own problems as the people of the town began to gossip and call our family murderers. Kids began to call me the devil's grandson, which led me to having a lot of fights. With no brothers or sisters, I had to fend for myself. Sometimes in my mind, I would try to move and attack like the big gray Wolfman would, jumping towards the kids while kicking and biting. It took a couple of fights, but eventually kids left me alone. Grandma was being shunned by the community. Everywhere she went, people were whispering and snickering, which took a toll on her. She isolated herself and started having problems sleeping at night by being terrorized in her sleep by the memory of these creatures. Coupled with the fact that she was worried about her son and husband being on the property with these creatures, caused her to start breaking down. Mr. David's wife was truly a lifesaver for my grandmother by giving her a sympathetic ear as both their husbands were in danger. They were both bonded by the trouble these creatures had created. While I was fighting for our family's name, grandmother was fighting for her sanity. Back at the property, my father and grandfather were fighting to protect our legacy. These yellow flies are eating me up. The Wolfman's third violent siege on the house. It was nightfall, and they began to hear a rumbling sound like an army was running through the woods. Standing with the back door open, it grew louder and louder until they saw the big gray one towering above the dead cornfield. They fired on him over and over. He was the target, the leader of the pack. The big gray one stepped back out of sight and let out a howl like no one's ever heard. They slammed the door and locked it behind them, heading towards the windows to watch the movement of the others. At the rear of the house, you could hear the small petal traps closing in the cornfield and the creatures yelping in pain as it ripped their flesh. And this is another graphic section. The sound of them sliding off the roof, which had been greased with thick motor oil, made my grandfather know his plan was working. Round after round was fired, and the Wolfman knew it was they who were being hunted. Finally, one of the large traps was set off on the west side of the house, and the creature cried out in pain. The men all rushed to the window to see it standing there with the trap spike lodged in its flesh above the knee. It attempted to open the trap with its claws while making this yipping sound as if it was calling for help. Then two other creatures approached. The look on the creature's face was one of panic and terror. They yipped back and forth, all looking concerned and confused. Then the other two creatures began to pull the trap apart, tearing the creature's flesh from the bones as they ripped the curled spikes out of its leg. The big gray one stepped out of the darkness and let out an enormous howl, and the rest of the Wolfman retreated into the darkness. Grandfather took one shot at the gray one, hitting him in the shoulder and wounding him. Everyone was in a celebration mood that night except Grandfather. He was now more worried than ever. The big gray one was now wounded and far more dangerous. In the morning, they walked the property and discovered 9 of the traps were missing and found trails of blood everywhere. These creatures were not invincible, and the night before had proved that. Examining the roof, they could see where one of the creatures had slid off the roof and landed near the trap, surmising that it was the one that got caught in the trap near the house. They could have tracked the creatures that day, but Grandfather decided it was best to stay near the house where they had the advantage. The following 2 nights were completely uneventful, and the farm seemed to take on a sense of peace and serenity that my father described as the good old days at Lockett Ranch. Even the air seemed fresher and cleaner, but again, Grandfather knew better. Preparing for a 4th violent retaliation attack from the Wolfman. He spent time setting more traps for what he knew was going to be a vicious attack. He took mud and dirt and packed it at the back steps, setting one of the larger traps there, surrounded by smaller traps. There was not a space around the house that had not had a trap set. Above the back door, he suspended a trap in midair using a chain running to the door strike plate on the door, so that way, if any creature tried to come in the back door, a trap would lock around its head. My grandfather was nervous. He knew since some of them were wounded, they would try to breach the house and come inside to kill them all. He was not a man of many words, but that day he sat down with my father and he told him how much he loved him. Barnabas would later describe it as he was saying his goodbyes to his son. All the events of the past month had made my grandfather very nervous, and he was a different man now. When talking to him, it felt as if there was something just beneath the surface bubbling, a darkness never felt before. I believed he had mentally journeyed to a dark place to prepare himself for his next encounter with the big gray one. I remember looking into his eyes. There was no fear, just an eerie calm, as if he had made peace and didn't care what happened next. During his visit with us, he held my grandmother in his arms like she was a newborn baby, telling her how much he loved her, how she made his life worth living. She looked up at him and had him promise that he would come back to us. My grandfather made that promise, but even she knew something had changed. Something was very different about my grandfather. When he and Mr. David left the house, they stood there in the road with my grandmother as a cloud of dust from the tires escorted the truck away from us. That night I prayed the Lord's Prayer, but stopped in the middle and asked God to keep my father and grandfather safe. That night I questioned God. Why did you even make these creatures? And what had my family done to deserve being attacked by them? I still remember falling asleep on my knees beside the bed, hoping that God had heard my prayers. The fourth and final violent Wolfman attack to collapse the house. From below and above, I'm sorry guys, I messed that up. These flies are eating me alive. The fourth and final violent Wolfman attack to collapse the house from below and above and kill the family. Back at the farm, my father had placed lighted lanterns around the house for extra light. He also took the remaining oil and poured it around the exterior of the house 40 feet away and pulled the truck inside the circle of oil, so in that way, if they needed to get out, he could light a fire to hold the creatures back while they escaped in the truck. At 3 a.m., one of the dogs began to stir. He didn't bark, but just walked over to the front door and sat there with his ears perked up looking at the door. Then the knob slowly began to turn left, then right. The dog cocked his head to the left and right in confusion. Then there was a sound of something hitting the tin roof. Looking out the window, there was one of the traps that had been thrown on the roof sliding down, making a god-awful screeching noise. The knob on the front door began to jiggle faster and faster. Grandfather moved from room to room, checking the windows and looking out. He saw the house was surrounded by wolfmen. There were not as many as before, only 6, but that was more than enough to kill everyone in the house. Then came a gentle knocking, scratching sound at the front door like fingernails were being scratched across the wooden door. Mr. David slowly approached the front door and put his ear against it. And just as his ear touched the door, there was an impact on the front door that shook the entire house. At the back of the house, my father thought he could hear digging coming from under the front floor. Confused and bewildered, they all gathered in the living room to figure out what was going on. This was a complete opposite of what had happened before. No growling, no howls, no warnings. Even the dogs were confused, moving from room to room, not barking, as if the creatures were moving in all directions. Looking out the window, the creatures were moving silently, some clockwise and some counterclockwise. The only sound was the yipping, as if they were talking to each other. Everyone snapped back to reality as the big gray one slammed the side of the house, which caused the plaster to fall from the ceiling. The wolfmen were strategically attacking the house quietly, looking for weaknesses. The movement outside was intended to confuse the dogs inside the house, and it was working. I got to pause for a second. I got to get some spray. These bugs are eating me up. All right, here we go. Back at the rear of the house, my father could feel the floorboards beginning to move under his feet, as if they were under the house, moving north to south. Yes, they were searching for weaknesses in the house, and soon they would create one. They would create one that was so unexpected that my family would be forced to make a decision on the future of the ranch. Grandfather, looking out the front window, made eye contact with the big gray one. Its jet black eyes with yellow pupils were so focused. It stared at him with a human expression of anger and malice, giving the impression that it was coming for him and only him. My grandfather raised his rifle through the bars on the windows and for the first time he realized how much he had underestimated these wolfmen. The big gray one looked down at the gun, realizing what it was, and then suddenly it leaped backwards 40 feet and ran alongside the house. He turned to Barnabas and said, "It knows what a gun is." In a drunken state, Barnabas replied, "Let's see if they know what a bullet is," and he fired one out the window. The impact that the big gray one had left in the side of the house had caused a crack in the plaster on the wall that ran from the floor to the ceiling. He was so much stronger than my grandfather anticipated, and would prove to be much smarter than anticipated. So far, the creatures this time had moved in silence, except for the big gray one slamming the front door and the side of the house, and a trap being thrown on the tin roof and sliding off, making a screeching sound like claws on a chalkboard. However, the silence was broken by growling coming from underneath the floorboards of the house, and a loud thumping sound began to shake the house foundations. The dogs began to bark and scratch at the floorboards. All hell was breaking loose. While the growling was getting louder and louder, Mr. David peeked out of the front window and saw the big gray one 45 feet away from the front door, crouched down and ready to slam the front door again. Grandfather just stood there listening to everything going on with his eyes glazed over as if he was in some kind of trance. He was thinking and trying to figure out what these creatures were doing, and then it hit him. They were trying to bring down the entire house. The digging was weakening the foundation, and the big gray one was going to knock the entire house down, or at least knock the front wall in. Another graphic section, you guys. Barnabas spotted one of the creatures in the dining room window and firing a shot, hitting it in the eye, which dropped it to the ground. It wailed and screamed in sounds of pain that almost sounded human-like. He fired a second shot, hitting it in the lower back. It gripped its back wound and loped off into the darkness. Then another impact hit the front wall of the house as the big gray one slammed into the house, growling, snarling, and completely enraged. As it took aim again to slam the front wall, my grandfather took aim at its legs, but it quickly leaped to the right and out of sight. That was enough for my grandfather, and he went to open the front door when his friend Barnabas grabbed him and asked him if he was crazy, because he would get them all killed. My grandfather had indeed lost his mind. His ranch was destroyed. He was separated from his family. Men he had known since they were boys had died on his watch, and just beyond the front door was the source of all of his problems, and there was nothing he could physically do to stop it. Leaning on the door, he slid to the floor and broke down crying, but not out of fear, but out of anger and frustration. I'm sitting on my towel. I have to use my shirt, sorry. Let me find out where I was. Oh. In the middle of all the chaos, Grandfather was having a meltdown. His whole body shook, and they all began to hear the wood roof trusses splinter and crack. It was only a matter of a short time before the big gray one would either knock the front wall in or take down the entire house. My father said those were very dark moments. He weighed the option of either shooting himself in the head or being eaten alive by these wolfmen. He described the feeling of the air being sucked out of the room when my grandfather lost the will to fight. Barnabas, now drunken and fearless, had discovered something. Shooting at the eyes of these creatures may not kill them, but it would send them running in the other direction. Barnabas moved from room to room, firing shot after shot out of the windows, hitting one in the nose, and it spun around yelping in pain. Barnabas had found a way to hurt these creatures, but unfortunately, he was not the best shot. Grandfather, however, was a deadly shooter with a rifle. Barnabas, in a drunken state, grabbed my grandfather off the floor and said with clenched teeth to him, "I don't shoot like you. You will have to do this. You have to man up and save us."
The fourth impact on the front wall was so powerful that the light fixtures fell from the ceiling. Grandfather, now refocused, he took aim out of the front window and he shot the gray one in the ear, severing the top portion of his ear. He fired a second time but missed as it leaped away from the house. This was now a cat and mouse game between my grandfather and the big gray wolf man. Every time it moved forward, he took a shot and it would move away. The front wall could not withstand a fifth impact. This went on for the next 2 hours to well after sunrise. Then, just as quietly as they came, all of the wolfmen left. The men had survived the night, but there was no victory. As they stood outside the house, it was clearly visible the front wall was leaning in towards the house. The roof had begun to separate from the wall studs, leaving a gap that a small child could climb through. At the northwest corner of the house, the traps had been moved and there was a hole where the creatures had dug under the house to get under the floorboards. Barnabas crawled down through this hole and discovered the shirt had been dug away from the foundations of the wall from Hold on. Let me reread that. I'm sorry. Barnabas crawled down through this hole and discovered the dirt had been dug away from the foundations of the front wall from east to west, and the digging had continued along the east side of the house. The bricks on the fireplace along the side of the house had been taken off and had been piled next to the house as if they were taking them out one by one and dropping them in a pile. Final abandonment of a ravaged ranch and family relocation. With the house on verge of structural collapse and no place to hide, my grandfather decided to abandon the property for good. That day he realized there was nothing more that could be done. 2 weeks later, he took the proceeds from the sale of the 100 acres and bought a house 50 miles away near where David lived. He bought a house. I got to redo that. Punctuation messed me up, and I got a blurry spot on my glasses. Guys, I'm sorry. That day, he realized there was nothing more that could be done. 2 weeks later, he took the proceeds from the sale of the 100 acres, and he bought a house 50 miles away near where Mr. David lived and where my family has lived up to this day. Taylor, Mississippi is still plagued by the activity of these wolfman creatures. And whether you are a believer or skeptic, it would be advisable to stay right where you are safe, and avoid these creatures at all costs. And guys, that's the end of that article. What an amazing article. That's scary. You know, for any living creature to go against these things. Guys, I'm going to get out of here. I may throw a few clips in, some of the game camera pictures. It's not a lot of stuff, but I may put a few pictures up. I don't know yet. But either way, y'all have a wonderful 4th of July weekend. Be safe. Be blessed in all you do. Be kind to one another. And remember, we're on short time. We ain't got a whole lot longer before the big man returns. So just get it right and make sure your lamps are filled. I love each and every one of you. God bless you. And again, if you'd like to see the pictures to any of the articles that we're doing now, with a few of the recent articles that we've already done, the pictures can be viewed on Don Moore's channel. I will put the link to his channel in the description below. If you have not subscribed to his channel, please subscribe to him. Let's help lift him up. He's got some beautiful areas that he goes to, but he cannot do a live stream from those areas until he hits 1,000 subscribers. Due to the threshold YouTube has put in place. So please just kind of show him some love. He's the one that's provided all of these articles for us. They've all come from Don Moore. Don, thank you greatly. I love you, brother. I love all of you that are here. Thank you so very much. I got to get home. I've got a lot of work today. I've been bush hogging the last few days and land clearing, and I just had to take a break this morning to get up here and do this, and I'm gonna get home and get back to work. But I will see you soon. Y'all have a fantastic afternoon. Oh, I've got to put on a dry shirt. I'm drenched. I sweat so bad, and I've probably got a bunch of ticks on me, I'm sure. But I'll see you guys. See you soon.